Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Passages Pulse. It's December. It's Christmas time. Today is Wednesday, December 3rd, 2025. It's about 11 a.m. Eastern Time at the time of this recording. Hi, Josiah. Happy December to you.
Happy December to you. I'm guessing from your tone of voice that you are a Christmas person. Is that right?
I love Christmas. Big fan of it. Although we always travel. We have always traveled, my wife and I, during this time. So we have never decorated for Christmas, and it's really sad. But this year we are. So looking forward to that. Before we talk about Christmas, though, how was your Thanksgiving? What was your favorite dish last week?
Favorite dish. I'm always all about the sweet potato casserole. When I have turkey on my cranberry sauce, my sweet potatoes, and I'm a happy man. It was a lovely time.
I'm glad to hear this because I've been in this country for almost 20 years, and I just learned this week that sweet potato casserole can be divisive. Apparently, some people really don't like it. I love it. I think it's amazing. So
good. I don't know why it's divisive. It feels like it should be a pretty strong unifier, but I'm glad you like it.
Well, friends, let us know what's your favorite dish from Thanksgiving from last week, and put in the notes if you're pro or against sweet potato casserole. That's what we want to know. Today, we are going to talk about the Prime Minister of Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has officially sent a request letter to the President of Israel. And Josiah, you can explain what's the difference between why does a country have a Prime Minister and a President? We don't have that here in America. The president of Israel, his name is Isaac Herzog, from a very influential historical family in Israel, the Herzog family. His father was president too. Why does the Prime Minister Netanyahu want a pardon? How would that even work, and what could that mean? So let's get into it. First of all, if Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, is asking for a pardon, it implies that he has a case, or maybe some cases against him. So just tell us about that. What is Netanyahu being accused of?
Yeah, great question. So I'm guessing some of our listeners are probably somewhat familiar with this, but just in case you're not, I'm going to give a very high-level overview of what these cases are. The reason why I say I'm assuming that some of our listeners are already familiar is because these cases have been ongoing for several years now. It's been a very long legal battle, very dramatic saga, if you will, about Prime Minister Netanyahu. There are a few different cases, some of which have been dropped to three, which are currently being considered are case 1,000, 2,000, and 4,000. Those numbers don't have any special significance. That's just how they're numbered and the names used for the different cases. And the common denominator between these various cases is going to be some combination of an accusation or an allegation of bribery, fraud, breach of trust, or general corruption of some kind. If you look at the specific cases in turn, they each have to do with this specific instance in which Prime Minister Netanyahu is accused of wrongdoing or corruption of some kind, typically in return for favors or positive coverage from a media institution or something like that. So you have case 1,000. This is often referred to as the gifts affair. And is basically accused of trading favors between himself and various wealthy businessmen or even Hollywood types in exchange for gifts of some kind. A very basic bribery case, very, very basic corruption case there. Case 2000, you have fairly significant institution in Israel in terms of media or news coverage, the Yediot Achronot. I believe this is a news website, and basically he's accused of, again, trading some favors in exchange for positive coverage from this news website or this news organization. Case 4,000 is a similar case where you have, in this case, a telecom company, and he's basically accused of trading some regulatory favors in exchange for some, again, positive coverage. This company requires, in order to operate and have a certain share of, for example, broadcast waves in Israel, you have to work with the government in order to get basic permissions or to be able to work through different layers of regulatory oversight. And he was more or less accused of helping to grease the skids or make things easier for them to get through that process in exchange, again, for some positive coverage, especially from another news website, very popular news website called Wallop in Israel. So there's some interesting cases here. And again, each of them sound fairly straightforward, but taken together, it's actually a pretty complicated mess that has, as I said, taken many years to actually unpack all the different legal arguments about what may or may not have happened. And as of today, the trial is ongoing. He's been sitting through testimony, giving testimony, being cross-examined for a while now. And that is sort of the background leading up to this pardon request.
Yeah, and we all remember that during the Iran war, how he had to be in and out of trial, like they had to postpone trials because of, or like hearings because of his, he needed to tend to security matters. So some of these cases have been going on for many, many years, like 5 or more. So
Mhm.
tell us about this crazy political system, a country that has a president and a prime minister. What's that about?
Yeah, I think it did perhaps raise a few eyebrows when the prime minister of Israel is sending a pardon request to the president of Israel, both because it's confusing in an American context that you would have both a prime minister and a president. Also because it's, if you are familiar with the system, the president is a fairly ceremonial role. So how does he fit into this equation? And there's I think basic few things that you need to know about Israel's political system. We're not going to get into all of it in terms of how it operates because that's a lot. There's not enough time to explain everything. In a nutshell, Israel is not like the United States because it is a parliamentary system. We in the United States have a very different system of government where there's a clean sort of separation between our executive, legislative, and judicial branches. In Israel, that doesn't really exist. The only branch that is really considered quote unquote independent is the judicial branch. The legislative and the executive branches are melded together in
Yeah.
the Knesset. So when you are elected, you're not elected as the prime minister per se, but as a member of Knesset or part of a party that achieves or receives a certain number of seats in the Knesset. Then the party that receives the most seats in the Knesset or Israel's parliament is going to be given the opportunity to form a government, or basically the equivalent of an executive branch that's actually going to manage the day-to-day creation and execution of policy for the country. The president does play a significant role in helping to move that process along because he essentially has the responsibility to, again, it's fairly ceremonial, but to formally request that a party work together to build a coalition in the Knesset to form a government. Now, there's about 120 seats in the Knesset, which means you have to have at least 61 people as a part of your coalition in order to form a government for the country. You have to have a basic majority to form a government for the country. Most parties can't do that by themselves, and so the president is going to invite them basically to create a coalition of parties that are then capable of doing so. And usually there's about, at least 10 to 12, in some years up to 15 parties running for the Knesset. So you're going to have quite a few different parties that you have to work with in order to build this coalition. It's a fairly fragile system in that sense that can fall apart relatively easily if any one of those parties or if 2 or 3 of those parties decide to leave. Now, I want to give one example that kind of helps to contextualize this, but also contrast it for the audience as well so you understand the role of the president. The easiest way to think about what Israel's system of government is like is think about the UK, for example. It's a parliamentary system. It functions very similar to the UK in that sense. The government is created out of the members elected to the legislative branch of the government. There are set lengths of terms, but it's also possible for the government to collapse early if there's a vote of no confidence in the government or the majority of the parliament that has created the government. The difference between Israel and the UK is that there's no monarch, obviously. So you don't have a king or queen of Israel. You have instead what's known as the president. The president basically fills many of the same functions that a monarch would, in the sense that they're considered a head of state as opposed to the head of government. So the prime minister is the head of government. They're responsible for the day-to-day, running of the government, making sure that the government actually functions, generates policy, carries it out, that sort of thing. The head of state is, again, a pretty ceremonial role. There's not a lot of real authority or power in the hands of the president, other than they have some sort of influence, the ability to, again, formally invite you to create a government, to propose or even offer to host negotiations or mediations if there's some sort of conflict within the government or the parliament. And crucially, very importantly for this conversation, they also have the ability to issue pardons if they are formally requested. So in Israel, the president is not just going to issue a blanket pardon. There's a formal process by which you have to submit a letter and documentation to a portal, which the president's team will then review and decide whether or not to grant a pardon to someone. So It's pretty interesting. The president doesn't have any real authority over the prime minister. The only thing that really gives him some leverage in a situation like this is that he has the power to issue or to deny a pardon to the prime minister, who otherwise would be considered the much more powerful figure in the equation between the two.
Yeah, I want to take the opportunity to say, just for our sake here in the United States, most of us who listen and watching this are in the United States. It goes to say something about our system of government. I think our democracy is the longest serving democracy in the world, in the history of the world, and it has been relatively stable. And like, I used to work for the Israeli government. I've said here before, for 3 years, from 2020 to 2022, 21, 22. So 3 years. And during that year, I think there were like 3 elections, maybe 4. It was a crazy time in Israel because the government will fall apart. They'll go to elections and then it will fall apart again, and they'll go to elections, and it was unstable. There was no budget that was officially approved. So it's just y'all in the Europe, in Israel, enjoy your parliamentary system. Just want to say I'm a really big fan of our system here, which because it's more stable. Let's talk about the pardon. And I think Christians listening, I think there is something here. I think there is a worldview issue here that we should keep in mind as Christians, because the life of a Christian is a repenting life. It's a life of repenting, admitting guilt before a righteous judge and asking for forgiveness. And also, there's no forgiveness without repentance. You need to repent in order to receive forgiveness. So let's keep that in mind here, which is not the point of the issue here, but I just think it is unavoidable for us as Christians to think about this. So let's talk about the pardon. How does a pardon work? What do we need to know about the pardon request that Netanyahu has officially sent? Tell us about it. What is he saying?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that are important to note about it. I'm not going to go through all of the details within, because supposedly the letter sent to the prime minister with the pardon request documentation was over 100 pages long. So
Wow.
we're obviously not going to get into all the exact minute details of what's
He sent the book, not a letter.
His lawyer did. I don't think the prime minister wrote that himself. I'm relatively confident his lawyer wrote it for him, and then he sent it. Suffice it to say, it's a very long document. We're not going to have time to get into all of it. There are 2 things I do think are worth just sort of reflecting on for a moment that make it interesting. There's really nothing in the letter or the documents supporting this pardon request that would be considered an admission of guilt. So that in and of itself is very interesting. It's raised a few eyebrows, of course, and raised some pretty interesting questions within Israeli society and elsewhere about, okay, what exactly is he requesting a pardon for if he's not actually admitting any sort of guilt or admitting any wrongdoing in these cases against him? Is it even possible to issue a pardon in a case in which there is no admission of guilt? Some opponents to this pardon are already raising legal arguments that a pardon should not be given because there's nothing to pardon until he actually admits or accepts responsibility for some alleged wrongdoing. That in and of itself is going to be a big issue that I think is going to play out over the next few weeks. Is a pardon actually appropriate given what he has or has not been willing to say in the request for the pardon itself? The second thing that I think is really very interesting is some of the reasoning that he's using as far as why this pardon is necessary. And what he's basically arguing is that it's not so much in his self-interest, but in the national interest that he's making this pardon request, which is very interesting. I think I'm a little bit cynical, so I sometimes have a hard time trusting a politician when they say that I'm making a sacrifice and I'm no way benefiting from these actions or these choices. I'm a little skeptical. Just put it that way. Sometimes I have a hard time trusting or taking those statements at face value. But that is noteworthy. That's his basic line of argumentation, is that this is what's best for the country. The country needs an end to this. If you look at the basic history of these cases, you can kind of see where he's going with this. These cases have not just been really, a massive problem for the prime minister, but also for the rest of the country in some significant ways, because it's led to this sharp divide. I mean, if you think in some ways that the American political system is polarized, it's pretty interesting the parallels in the Israeli political system, or even how much worse it can be in some situations in Israel. It's very divided, Israeli society, and Israeli politics in many ways have become a debate about not necessarily what is good policy or what is not, but a referendum on the prime minister. Is he a good guy or a bad guy? Should he be a part of the government or not? Can other parties morally justify sitting with him in a government coalition or not. And the fact that Israeli politics have become so divisive and reduced to a question like that and have not been able to focus on some other pretty serious questions like Israel's economy or Israel's national security, there is a growing consensus in Israel to a certain degree that some of the downstream effects of these trials, like the controversy surrounding the judicial reforms, for example, were they good faith reforms of the judicial system, or were they an attempt by Prime Minister Netanyahu to escape legal responsibility or consequences? Those were some very lively debates that had a massive impact on Israeli society. And the downstream effects, even from there, are that some people believe that's part of why October 7 happened, because the country was so divided and weakened internally and distracted by these legal dramas that they were not aware of or prepared for the threat that was fully realized on October 7. So that's
And
kind of where,
allegedly, the terrorist Yahya Sinwar identified
right.
that weakness and wanted to allegedly take advantage of that weakness that the country was divided, and he chose to attack now for this reason.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he followed Israeli news very closely and knew that this was a vulnerability in Israeli society that he could exploit. And that's where Prime Minister Netanyahu is coming from. He's making this argument that enough is enough. You know, this has been going on for many years now, and it's really crippled Israeli society in some ways. It's become a massive controversy that sort of dominates everything else. It's led to dysfunction within our government. It's part of why there's been so many failed governments over the past few years and so many early elections over the past several years. It may have a direct and adverse effect on our national security as a country. He's arguing basically that we need to put this behind us in order to move on. It's a fascinating argument. I think the question a lot of people are asking is, does he mean it, or is he just trying to save himself? Yeah, that's a really hard question to answer. I'm not going to try to answer that question right now, and I think it is important for the audience to understand, like, that's kind of the question that's being asked right now and the issue that's being debated in Israel.
Yeah, and I think there's one more. Well, first of all, it's fascinating that somebody's asking him for a pardon without admitting guilt. It's like, please pardon me, but I didn't do anything wrong. So that's just highlights what a capable political operative Netanyahu is. This guy has survived everything. He gets away with a lot. In the sense of, like, he survives a lot of things. He makes new alliances, he pivots. It's really remarkable as a political case study. But also, once again, he is asking for forgiveness without saying that he did something. And as I believe Yair Lapid, I heard this on the Times of Israel's podcast, that Yair Lapid, the opposition leader, has said that he will support this pardon, but only if Netanyahu admits guilt, or admits that there's wrongdoing, which obviously will be a great political score for the opposition. So let's talk about what happens next and what will be the implications. So Netanyahu's corner here, Herzog, he has given a binary decision. He has to either say yes and upset a lot of people in Israel, or say no and upset Netanyahu's base. So he has put him in a really precarious situation. So what would be the implications here, Josiah?
I think there's a third option. First of all, I would agree you're right
option.
That it does put the president in a very tough position, because you have to, let's talk about the binary and then we'll get to the third option. Of the two options that Sebastian gave, he says yes or he says no. I mean, both of them are very tough choices, and I want to maybe further elaborate on why they're so difficult. If he says yes, what are the implications of that? The implications of saying yes to Prime Minister Netanyahu's request for a pardon essentially is that the precedent that has already been set in Israel, that even the highest level of elected official is not above the law, would effectively be weakened. This is not totally unprecedented, the idea that a very high-level official would be accused of wrongdoing and would have to face potential legal consequences. And in fact, even former prime ministers have wound up in prison for some legal wrongdoing or things that they've done.
Yeah, like famously President Ehud Olmert, who went to jail for corruption, right?
The prime minister, but he did. So it's not as if there's no precedent for this. And Israeli society has really leaned on the idea, or relied on the idea, that there is equality before the law. There is a strong sense of rule of law in Israel, which is essential for trust in your government and in your shared society, and that even the strongest or most powerful among us have to face consequences for when they do things that are illegal. If you were to pardon Prime Minister Netanyahu, particularly if there is no admission of wrongdoing, then it's going to weaken that confidence in Israel. And it would also leave a lot of people feeling unsatisfied because they don't have an answer to the question, did he really do right or wrong? To back up a little bit to before this case even began, I remember years ago, I don't think I ever actually published it, but I wrote an opinion piece basically arguing that the trial needed to happen
Hmm.
because the crisis of confidence wasn't going to go away until there were some clear, definitive answers about is he innocent or guilty. It wasn't fair, in my opinion, for Prime Minister Netanyahu to face these accusations without the ability to defend himself.
Yeah.
It also wasn't fair to the country for these accusations to be out there without some sense that they were going to be proven right or wrong, because now you just have this sense of hesitation constantly. You're always wondering, is my government actually playing by the rules, doing what's best for the country and not for themselves? You have to be able to trust your leaders. And people were always going to be mistrustful of their leaders until there was an answer to this question. Did he or did he not do something wrong?
And
I
Netanyahu
just felt
wanted
like,
this. His position up until now was, I'm going to go to trial. I'm going to show the truth, and I'm going to beat this. I'm going to show that I did nothing wrong until
right.
now.
He did. He made the argument that he should have a trial in order to clear his name. And I basically made the argument that it was best for the prime minister and for Israel for a trial to happen. Now, in hindsight, I would say that relied on the assumption that the trial would actually be finished and that there would be some conclusion to the trial, some answer to these questions. The longer it drags out and the less likely it appears that we're ever going to actually get some answers to those questions. Maybe in hindsight, I might revise my argument a little bit. But that, I think, one of the potential implications of saying yes to this pardon is that, one, you potentially weaken people's confidence in the rule of law. And two, you also reduce their confidence in the government because they don't know whether they can trust the government or not if they don't get an answer to what the prime minister has been up to these past several years. So that's a potential problem. If you say no, however, you wind up in a pretty tough situation because now you're basically arguing that the prime minister needs to finish the trial, and you're suggesting that there is some sense of a wrongdoing that needs to be punished, which again may or may not be true. We really don't know until this trial concludes and there's a verdict to make of this. You're also going to confirm the bias of a lot of Netanyahu supporters that this whole thing has been a witch hunt. It's been about removing him from office or destroying him politically, not really about getting to the truth. And if you just issue a blanket no to the pardon, the president's going to have to explain why. Why is he issuing a no? What does he expect the country to benefit or to gain from seeing the trial through to its conclusion? And why should people trust the process that's gotten them to this point? The third option, though, that I do want to mention, Sebastian, because I do think there is a third option that most commentators I've listened to seem to think is the most likely, is that it's not going to be a yes or a no. It's going to be something like a yes, but, or a yes, if.
Yeah, like
a conditional
with a
yes.
promise. Yeah.
Right. You can have a pardon if the prime minister agrees to certain conditions, like making an actual admission of guilt, which again has not been made until this point, like perhaps promising to accept certain conditions about the rest of his political life, whether that be he retires immediately or whether he promises not to run for re-election next fall when the next elections are currently scheduled for, or some end date that they perhaps negotiate in terms of how much longer he continues to be active politically in Israel. Those are some of the things that are kind of discussed right now, debated. I think as far as what is likely to happen to get us to a point where a decision is made, a couple things. One, the president is going to, of course, have to receive a lot of legal advice about how to read this request, what to do with it, what his options are exactly. The second thing is I wouldn't be surprised if there's some sort of quiet negotiations between the president's team and the prime minister's team about what sort of conditions would be attached to a pardon if it were to be given to Prime Minister Netanyahu. And then the question becomes, is he willing to accept those conditions, the prime minister? And I don't want to speculate right now. I think we need to see what those conditions are before we begin to have that conversation. But that seems to be where things are trending at the moment.
Yeah, Josiah, there is something else here that we haven't talked about, and is the President Trump's involvement in this. So President Trump said when he went to, after the deal that liberated the hostages that started the process to end the war, which, by the way, it's not over, and there's still one more body left, right, Josiah, that they still haven't produced. We'll talk about that in coming episodes. So at the Knesset, at the Israeli parliament, the president of the United States, Trump, said to President Herzog, forgive him, forgive him. And he was saying, like, it's just some cigar, some champagne, alluding to one of the cases. So President
Yeah.
Trump has, after that, I think a couple of weeks after that, he officially sent a letter to President Herzog saying, please forgive Netanyahu. And Trump is kind of saying, the country needs to move on. Let's move on from this. Josiah, what do you think about that, real quick?
I'm not overly surprised. President Trump, even in the context of our own political system, does seem to be fairly in favor of issuing pardons. He himself has issued quite a few pardons to Americans accused of wrongdoing. So it doesn't surprise me that much that he would see them as a solution to a problem that he thinks, yeah, if there's a problem and a pardon can fix it, then of course the pardon should be given. It seems fairly consistent with President Trump's reasoning. I'm not sure, let's just say, I'm not sure I totally agree that it is the solution to this problem in Israel. I think it depends on, again, the exact sort of terms of the pardon and the conditions that are attached to it. It seems early to say whether it's a good idea or not until we have more details about what it would actually entail. But it would be, I'll just say this, probably a mistake to compare apples and oranges to this point. Say that the
Yeah.
types of pardons that President Trump is issuing is the same kind of pardon that Prime Minister Netanyahu would receive. Not necessarily, not until we know the details of what sort of pardon President Herzog is actually willing to give. So it's a bit early right now to speculate in terms of whether it's the same kind of pardon, whether the same reasoning applies, whether it's a good idea or not. Just a bit early to say.
Yeah, and I think President Trump his vision might be influenced by from his point of view, the legal persecution that he has confronting the United States. There was a lot of legal cases brought against him before he got reelected, and he might see this as like the same thing going on in Israel. I would say I don't think it's ideal. I wish President Trump wouldn't say that. I think it's inappropriate for him to get involved in another country's politics that way. And here's what I mean. Israeli people see Trump as as Israel's greatest friend. So it's not Americans, it's not Christians, it's not Jewish people, it's Israelis themselves say that Trump has been Israel's best friend from a presidential point of view, that we never had a better president, friend of Israel. So I think he's coming from a place of like tough love, like I'm a friend, but he's getting involved. I do think let's imagine President Mandani one day gets involved and starts saying that the court system in Israel should indict the prime minister of Israel. So for a president of the United States to get involved, if a president of the United States gets involved that way, we would be screaming about it. We're like, this is inappropriate. You shouldn't be doing that. And I think we should hold the same standard when a president is trying to influence in favor of the current prime minister of Israel. So I don't think it's ideal. Also, I'll just say this. President Trump has said twice publicly, giving a shout out to Ms. Miri Edelson, who is a big donor of his. He said this when I was at a conference, the Israeli American Committee's conference. He gave a shout out to Miri, and then he gave another shout out to Miri at the Knesset speech where he asked Herzog to forgive Prime Minister Netanyahu. And why do I mention this? Because Miri is kind of involved in one of these cases. She owns one of the newspapers that is party to one of the cases, I think case 2000. So I just think that's messy. President Trump's one of his biggest donors being involved there, and President Trump saying, please forgive. In this case, by the way, Mary is the victim. She is not the beneficiary of a favor. She is the victim. But I just wanted to mention that I think it's not ideal. So, well, Josiah, I think we're done. I hope a good service to our audience to talk about this so we can understand a little bit more of the system and this pardon situation. So since we are a Christian podcast, so now let's respond as Christians. I talked about forgiveness and the necessity to repent and how I think they should trigger our brain to think about that. But what's on your mind? How do you think Christians should respond, and how should we pray about this?
I think while my line of thinking about the merits of having this trial are probably more nuanced than they were when I was thinking about this many years ago before the trials began. One thing that hasn't changed is this nagging sense I can't get rid of, that the Israeli people really need to know the truth. And that doesn't necessarily mean that Prime Minister Netanyahu needs to be punished, because the truth might be that he is in fact innocent of wrongdoing. The American political system, justice system relies upon this principle that you are innocent until proven guilty, and I think we should apply that as well to this situation. But it's important to know, is he innocent or guilty? What is the truth? What actually happened? Because of some of the things we discussed during this episode, really bad things can happen when you don't know the answer to a question like that, and the question is being asked of one of the most powerful people in your country. who's responsible for your well-being, your safety, your security. And the fact that there are no good answers to that question, I think, is a pretty strong vulnerability for Israeli society right now, for the Israeli political system. I think politically, it's very important. Pragmatically, it's very important that the truth comes out. As a Christian, I would say morally, ethically, it's very important for the truth to come out as well. My hope is that however this gets resolved, that at some point the truth will become clear, that it will allow for a rebuilding of trust to happen between the Israeli people and some of their leaders, elected officials, and that there will be, this rebuilding sense that the truth matters and that it is prioritized and valued very highly, and that it will be elevated no matter what the ultimate outcome is in terms of a verdict.
Yeah, I want to say two things. Let's narrow in the issue itself of Israel, and then I want to extrapolate it to our Christian life, Christian thinking. First of all, I think we should pray for justice. I think if you read the Old Testament, there's one thing that will not escape your mind, and it's that God cares about justice being done in the land of Israel. And I think if God is the same yesterday, today, and always, then God cares about justice in general. Like, it's really, God screams about this throughout the prophets. He talks about the orphans, the widows, like being taking care of them. God talks a lot about idolatry. Like, he indicts Israel for idolatry a lot. He charges them with idolatry a lot. And we get that. We're like, yeah, they got kicked out because of idolatry, but also because of injustice, because they're not being judged. The Lord hates on unbalanced scales, right? So the Lord cares a lot about justice. So I think, friends, we just can't avoid this. Like, the Bible is very clear. The Lord is just, and we should pray for justice to be done. That there will be justice. That I also just say, I want to extrapolate. So I want to add a third point here. I'm very uncomfortable with this increasingly use of executive power in the United States to grant pardons. Like President Biden, before he left, he preemptively pardoned himself and his whole family and a bunch of people. President Trump came in, and one of the first things he did, he granted pardon to a lot of people who were involved in the January 6th thing. And I don't think we should live in a world where people commit crimes and then their political friends just forgive them, pardon them. That is a perversion of justice. And I think we as Christians need to care about this. That if we keep doing this, we will devolve into a state of complete injustice and chaos. So in Israel, because we love Israel, because we love the Jewish people, we want Israel to be a stable country with functioning democracy. It's a flawed system, but it's the best system we've come up with so far. So let us pray for justice and truth. Israel does not depend on one politician. Israel depends on God's mercy and justice. So, and then the second thing that I originally wanted to mention is extrapolating to our Christian life. I do think it's humbling to think about this trial and not avoid thinking that one day we'll stand before the ultimate judge of all things. So have you ever gone before a judge? TMI here, but have you? I have.
I have not. I am
Okay.
a squeaky clean individual.
You never got a speeding ticket? Wow. Okay. I did get a speeding ticket and I had to go before a judge. And in Georgia,
You are basically a criminal, Sebastian. You
in
should be more
Georgia,
careful.
you had to plead either guilty, not guilty, or there's this thing where I think every 5 years you can plead something called nolo contendere, which means no contest. So you're not guilty, and then they just give you a ticket, you pay it, no points in your license, something like that. So I plead that. Well, guess what? When we go before the ultimate judge, we will not get to plead nolo. We will be found guilty. And this is in my mind right now because our pastor is preaching through the book of Jude, and in it, the fact that God will judge the world is very clear. And pastor was saying that the people who will be judged guilty and will be condemned to hell will agree with God's judgment. Will agree, yes, you're right. God is right here. So I think all of this, friends, we can't avoid it. What a great reminder to think about this world issue of we will all face a judge one day, and we will not be able to plead not guilty. So it's a reminder to repent and trust and rejoice if you have already repented and embraced the gospel that we have been forgiven, and that when the Lord reads the deeds that we have done, we will be forgiven because of Jesus paid the price. And then if you haven't done that, friend, you should consider repenting, believe and trust in Jesus, and reach out to somebody in the comments, reach out to somebody at Passages. We'll be happy to talk to you about this. So Josiah, again, not where we probably intended to land on this podcast, but I just think we can't avoid it as Passages people here. So Josiah, thank you for today's podcast. Thank you for last week's special episode. If you haven't seen the episode with Johnny Moore, please go listen to it. Really grateful that we were able to have Reverend Johnny Moore with us. We wanted to tell people that we'll have 2 more episodes this year, right? Next week, we'll do another one. And then there'll be a special one right before Christmas. Josiah, tell us, kind of tease out what we can expect before we wrap up the year.
Yeah, we'll have one more regular episode next week. We'll have another episode the following week with Passage's CEO, Zach Bauer. Very excited for that. And then we'll be taking a week off for Christmas because both Sebastian and I and you, the audience, all deserve a break for the holiday. So we'll be looking forward to taking some time for Christmas with our families. Hope you enjoy the season as well with your families of this Christmas holiday.
Thank you for listening, everybody. We'll see you next week in another episode. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passage's Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you like this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.